Hello and welcome to my brand new channel. On this channel, hopefully I'm going to be doing a number of old school AD&D module reviews, focusing on those that don't get as much publicity. There's lots of people out there who've reviewed the most common ones, the classics of Let's Just Keep on the Borderlands and Against the Giants, but there's quite a few modules that seem to have crept under the radar. What I want to look at is whether they're worth playing or worth ignoring. I'll be starting by looking at the series of modules published in the UK in the early and mid-80s. Unsurprisingly, they've got the UK code on the top left, and this is the first one, UK1, Beyond the Crystal Cave, published in 1983. The general premise of the adventure is that two young lovers have fled their feuding families. Locals believe they've run into a nearby cave and from there found their way into an enchanted garden. Here's where the adventurers come in. They need to force their way through the cave, into the garden, and get the two teenagers back to their parents. Most of the adventure takes place in that garden, and with it being a wilderness style setting, it does recommend that the party has a druid, which it makes a refreshing change. It is also very much a thinking module and not a fighting module, though I will come to that later on in the review. Firstly, let's look at the presentation of the module. Now, obviously, presentation isn't the single most important aspect, but it is nice to have an initial oomph, something pleasing about it. But, of course, even the most slick presentation won't rescue what could be, in essence, a very poor module. It is a good-looking cover, nice shade of dark blue with a very appealing bright picture depicting the eponymous Crystal Cave. But if you do look quite closely, there is something that you won't be able to unsee. Look at the fighter's sword, specifically its curve. It's back to front and it's never going to fit in that scabbard. That aside, yeah, it is a nice picture. The rear image of a fighter in battle with a treant is not as good as the front piece, but it does give the right impression of what's in the adventure. Internally, the maps are clear, functional, nothing special, but they are easy enough to read. But the interior art by Tim Truman is mostly excellent. It gives a really nice dark atmosphere, and even though on the surface this module appears quite whimsical, the inner art is representative of the undertones of the module. Now on to the meat of the module itself. What's in it? What's the story like? And what sort of challenge does it offer? Firstly, let's have a look at the basic premise. From the front of the module. Fleeing from their feuding families, two star-crossed lovers sought refuge in the Cave of Echoes, fabled in legend. Desperate for the return of their loved ones, the families are offering a large reward to any band of brave adventurers who will enter the caves in pursuit of the couple. But will bravery be enough? For who knows what lies beyond the Crystal Cave? Immediately what leaps out is a link to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. It's clearly taking a lot of inspiration from that classic Shakespeare work, and a number of reviewers in the past have criticised it for that. Nonsense. D&D has always borrowed from other sources. Tolkien, Howard. Gygax himself, in some of his early modules, used quite a lot of Lovecraftian imagery as well. So to criticise a module just because it is British, on the fact that it borrows from the Bard of Avon and the most classic and tragic love story of all time, sorry, I don't buy that. Now, the idea of the adventure is to access this magical garden. The adventurers do that through a puzzle. Then they need to, once they're in the garden, they need to make the end area appear, and that is through another puzzle. And then they need to solve a riddle in order to escape the garden with or without the young couple. So this is a thinking adventure. You cannot hack and slash your way to success. The creatures in the garden are mostly, I say mostly, not initially aggressive. That all depends on the attitude of the adventurers and how the adventurers themselves approach the creatures. The creature choices in the garden are very authentic for the setting. You start off in an encounter with some leprechauns. There are pixies, there are dryads, there are satyrs, there are animals large and small. There's a treant that I've already mentioned, and these fit the setting really, really nicely. Bear in mind though, a lot of these creatures have charm effects, which some people these days seem to find a little bit triggering. I don't. Treat the creatures with respect, they won't charm you. Treat the creatures with hostility, expect to be charmed. Actions have consequences. Also, there is the effect that a lot of typical spells do not work or do not work in their normal manner within the garden. And some people these days seem to find that troublesome. As in, I've picked Fireball, I want my mage to blast things, I've made my mage to blast things. Again, nonsense. Use your brain. Be creative, do something else. One interesting facet of the garden is that it has a protector, and I like this. The protector is a figure drawn from Old English mythology, known as the Green Man. Now, he won't hurt the party specifically, but what he does do is he makes them very, very drunk. So he incapacitates them. Again, it's similar to the effect of a dryad or a satyr, that it delays progress, which is incredibly important, because while you're in the garden, time is running much more slowly. Going to the garden for a day, a year or two passes in the outside world. So if you spend that day drunk as a skunk, then people in the outside world could forget you even exist. As I've already said, the key in this adventure is not to go out there waving swords. It's to role play your way through, to think about it. And even though a lot of the creatures are sort of magical fey beasts and animals, at the level the adventure is pitched at, these can be quite dangerous, and they can quite easily strip you of your weapons and your armour, especially the leprechauns with their polymorph abilities. So do be careful, be very careful. Go in there waving swords and you're probably not going to come out. Right, so let's have a look now at what is good about the adventure. What do I like about it? It's ambitious. Back in the early 80s, most adventure modules were dungeons where you run around killing things. Yeah, you can negotiate bits and pieces. There are riddles here and there, and there's some good fun houses around which are based on riddles and magical effects. But here was an adventure where the idea was to approach it in a pacifistic manner. That's ambitious. The whole feel of the adventure is right as well. A magical garden, an idyllic setting, the right sort of creatures, and the right sort of approach for that sort of environment is needed from the players. It's very much a thinking players module, and as such it is possible for a fairly weak, fairly low level party to be a lot more successful than a higher level party who are much more rash in their approach. It's also really good for druids, and to a lesser effect rangers. It puts them in their home environment, which is nice to see. And in the original AD&D adventure, druids acted as if they were one level higher than their normal level of experience. They got a boost, which really brought them to their fore. It's a very well written adventure as well. The text is nice and descriptive, it's clear, it's not wordy, it's easy to follow, and it is a pleasure to read. Okay, so those are good points. Let's look at the bad points. So nothing's perfect. It's not a module that is for everyone. I've run it 3 times. One of my groups, once they found out what it was all about, refused to play. They weren't interested. They wanted to kill dragons. They wanted to take treasure. They weren't interested in negotiating with pixies. But the other groups I've run through it absolutely loved it. So you've got to pitch it at the right type of group. If you've got a group of murder hobos, don't bother. Don't bother at all. It's not for them. But if you've got a real story-driven group, a group who like to use their brains, who like to solve puzzles, and not just puzzles as in your Rubik's Cube type sliding blocks and all that sort of stuff type puzzles, but just generally how to deal with potentially awkward situations and how to work with the environment. It really will. It's the sort of adventure that will suit them. Another possible problem with it is it can be over too soon. If your party get the idea of what they're meant to do pretty quickly, then it can be all over in about 5 or 6 hours. It's not a long adventure. And it's got a lot of freedom in the adventure as well, which does mean that the DM has to read pretty much everything in there, because the party can roam pretty much wherever they want around the garden. And a lot of that might be wasted because they can find what they need to succeed in various places, which means half the encounter areas will never be visited, yet the DM needs to know them, needs to have prepared them beforehand. So it does have that feel that does affect a number of adventures which do offer this level of freedom, in that you feel like you're almost over preparing. And I know I probably spent 6 to 8 hours getting the session ready. We started at about 7 o'clock in the evening. We finished about 1 o'clock in the morning and finished the adventure completely. So about 6 hours of play from about 6 to 8 hours of preparation. It's not a great ratio, but we enjoyed it. And one of my players said it was, of all the modules we played, it was his favourite. So in that sense, it was worth it. Okay. One thing that has happened with D&D over the years is the general approach has changed. Modern groups have different ideals to groups from my era. And so how does this adventure stack up in terms of appealing to a modern group? I do have to say that the crash bang wallop approach of a lot of modern D&D, where it's very superhero in feel, very heroic, it might not suit them. Some people might feel frustrated, especially fighter players, rogue players. They don't get to use their stabbing powers much here. This is one for the mages, the clerics, the druids. Those who do like a strong story, though, should enjoy it. It is really easy to convert it for 5th edition because there's no real balance issues to take into effect, given that most things need not be fought. And but there is that issue towards charm effects. I have seen quite a few online discussions saying, oh, they're evil, they're nasty, it's taken away by agency. There are a lot of charm effects in this garden, and if players aren't the sort to accept that, then it might be worth avoiding it. In summary, though, this is an interesting adventure. It's an ambitious adventure, especially when you take into account when it was released, back in 1983. and it's very much worth a look if you think that the style and subject matter will appeal to your group. It's a lot of fun, it's different, it's enjoyable, it's very authentic feeling, and it's a challenge. No two ways about it. It is a challenge, and that's why we play D&D. I'd give it, I'd say, 7 out of 10, above average. Worth a look. You can find a copy on eBay. I'm British now, so I'm going to give it in British currency, typically between about £10 and £15. Well worth picking up for that sort of price. Any more than that, don't bother, just wait, be patient. But yeah, around £10, £15 will get you a solid copy, and it is worth a look. Thanks for listening.